Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the FitBigStrong podcast. My name's Ashton, and I'm surprised we made it to the second. No, not really. I was planning to make a second. And I'm very excited about today's topic, and that is periodization for powerlifters. So, kind of what is periodization, and then we're going to kind of dive into kind of what makes you the strongest powerlifter, and then therefore why we phase our training. That'll make a bit more sense in a little bit. And then what is it that generally how we kind of phase things to become the strongest you possibly can. That's kind of like what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to break down what those phases are. So, spoiler alert, we phase our training. And they are generally distinct phases for very distinct benefits. So, we're kind of going to break those down as well. Alright, periodization. What is periodization? Well, I define it as distinct training phases over time, so different ways of training in certain points of time, to elicit the best sports-specific outcome. And what that means in powerlifting is train in a way in which different parts of the year, different times away from competition, doing that so you produce the best outcome on the platform. That's kind of what we're going for here when I define periodization is how can we plan our time to produce the best sports outcome on comp day. And that's generally done about 4 to 12 months. So in my opinion, any shorter than 4 months of planning, you kind of just like, oh, you could get a bit more benefit, but any further than 12 months, it's just, things change too much, like competitions with COVID. It's just all over the place. But hopefully what this concept has suggested is that it's better to be training differently throughout the year than not. And we're kind of going to break that down. So, what creates the strongest powerlifters? You're probably wondering. I'm not going to tell you it's this secret supplement or the steroids they're using, which contribute. Fundamentally, what is it? Well, a high motor unit recruitment within the competition lifts. So what that means is, so your muscle fiber, just to really quickly phrase this podcast isn't going to be a simple guide. This is for more of the intellectual people who want to kind of expand their knowledge. There may be some concepts within this podcast which aren't 100% clear, but I would still encourage you to try and listen through it and leave me your questions so you become more capable of being a good powerlifter. So, your muscle fibers. So imagine you've got a bunch of, this is going to be a really weird analogy. You've got a bunch of peas in a pot, right? And they represent all your muscle fibers. And then imagine you have a piece of spaghetti, why the fuck am I talking about spaghetti, attached to each one of these peas. But they attach to a bigger pea. Imagine a pea, which is just bigger, right? And what that pea represents is what's called the neuromuscular junction. So muscle fibers, the only way they actually activate, like a bundle of muscle fibers, is if they are innervated with nerves by a junction. And so what happens is your brain sends a signal down the spinal column. Let's say you're trying to tense your biceps. So the brain sends a signal down your spinal column into your arm to the neuromuscular junction of one of the ones that innervate the biceps, and then it activates the biceps, and boom, you get a contraction. So that's how that works. And we don't activate all our muscle fibers all at once. Could you imagine just trying to scratch your nose and all the fibers got activated at once, and you just smack yourself in the face with sheer forces that you just break your nose? We don't always activate our fibers all the time, even when we are going for maxes, especially when you are new, because your technique isn't optimized and you haven't developed the mastery and had enough exposure to these weights over time to actually fully activate these fibers. And so sometimes just gains come from getting better technique because you use these fibers more. And you also get gains from just doing the lifts more because you get better at using these motor units. And then we also have a good foundation of muscle. Fundamentally, if you take those fibers, let's say you have 100% activation, right? Like you got to fucking pick your nose and you're just like, phew, like you just pull your nose off you. If you made those muscle fibers bigger, all else equal, you'll be stronger. And so people always be like, our bodybuilders, they really are, they're really big, but they're not that strong. It's like, all else equal, they're stronger than you because they have more muscle. And so as a powerlifter, it is our goal to get as much muscle as we can within a given weight class and to also maximally activate the muscle fibers. So obviously there's other factors like your genetic response to training, because the best in the world obviously recover and adapt quicker, but they still fundamentally fall under these two categories of what we can control or the best to our ability. So, why would we phase our training? You can't get as big and as strong as possible within the same block. And you can eventually, but not without periodization. So you can't do a strength phase, a pure peaking strength phase, and be as strong as possible while also building the most muscle in that block you could. You can build a lot of muscle, and you can maintain that muscle while you get a maximum strength, but that's to the extent you can go. Okay? And one of the reasons is building muscle is best grown in the 5 to 30 rep range. And that's a really big rep range. And so muscle growth can occur kind of throughout, but with max competition strength, we are much more confined. We are confined to that 1 to 3 rep range. This is during peaking, which we'll describe what is later. And so what happens is your central nervous system actually adapts differently to those things. So when it comes to hypertrophy, when you're doing higher reps, let's say you're doing 15 reps on leg press, your CNS adapts to send out signals to those neuromuscular junction. It sends weaker but more frequent pulses. So you get more adapt to generating the forces required for a 15 rep. Whereas maximum strength, it's the complete opposite. You want as much as possible within a short window of time, right? So that's kind of how it works. And if you were to send 15 of the strongest signals as possible, you would end up with the adaptations of the 15 rep range, because the body is limited with resources. There's a reason why it's a 1 rep max and an 8 rep max, and they're different loads. It also comes down to energy systems. So the adaptations between those two are completely different. So you're not going to get as maximally strong doing sets of 10 for a set of 1. Hopefully that's clear. So obviously we kind of cover this, but why not train for both at the same time? Well, jack of all trades, master of none. And so if you try to pursue those two adaptations, you're going to get a different outcome. Okay? And so interestingly enough, if you are trying to, let's say, get 1 rep, let's say you're trying to develop reps on the bench for 1 rep max and 8 rep max, okay? So you do your first sets of singles, and then let's say you do some triples or something like that. Or let's say you just do 5 singles for simplistic state. And you, over the week, begin to adapt for those singles. And then later in the week, you do your 3 sets or 4 sets of 8. Because those adaptations are different, what might actually happen is that during the adaptations for the sets of 8, you can take away some of that energy or those adaptations for the sets of 1. So not only are you spreading your resources finer, but you're also actually opposing the adaptations you were trying to achieve. So there is just no way around it. You cannot be the best at one thing. You can be really good at 2 things, but you can't be the best. And also, let's say you were trying to pursue max strength. Well, max strength benefits from a low fatigue environment. And because the reason is because fatigue masks performance. If your fatigue is really high, you can't express max strength within training. And because you can't express it, you can't reach the minimum requirements for adaptation, and therefore you don't adapt. So if you do lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of work and high fatigue work, you're reducing the amount of max strength you can actually produce. And the difference with the hypertrophy training within that 5 to 30 is we can tend to handle a little bit higher fatigue states. And so because of that, we can handle higher fatigue, we can do more work. And because we do more work, we gain more muscle. And so the two systems just oppose each other. And there's also another one. So this concept is called adaptive resistance. And so what it describes is, over time as we train, our body becomes less sensitive to a given stimulus. So for example, if you did sets of 5 permanently for like the rest of your life, because you read like Starting Strength and you drink like a gallon of milk, you just do sets of 5 permanently, only some people might get that reference. But if you get that reference, hello. Let's get back on topic. If you do sets of 5 permanently, each set or each block of 5s become less responsive. So what I mean is, I made these numbers up, but it's to represent a concept. So block 1, you're doing sets of 5 the first time, you get 20% gains. What does that mean? It's just for math, okay? And then next block you get 17. Okay, well the body could just be slowing down its adaptations, because in general we slow down over time, but furthermore there's adaptive resistance, because the third block you get 11% gains. You've had almost a 50% reduction in the gains you could have gotten. But instead, maybe it looks like 20%, 19.5%, 19% of what you could have had if adaptive resistance wasn't a factor. And so how do we actually resolve this problem? I can just tell you, oh, what are you going to be scared of doing sets of 5? It's like, no, don't be scared of sets of 5. Variation fixes this problem. So that's in things like exercise selection, tempo, rep ranges, loads, that can act block to block to result in adaptations. And so an example of this might look like you do sets of 8, and then you do sets of 6, and then you go back to sets of 8 with a different variation, or you go back to the same variation. So what you do is you do some form of little change, a small change, and that actually mitigates the effects of adaptive resistance. And so if you, let's say you're leading up to a competition, if all you did was do singles for 3 blocks straight, right, you just won't become as strong as you can. And then I'd ask the question, why not do 5s, and then 3s, and then 1s, so you taper into it? Well, that's going to prevent staleness, and it's also going to generate specific adaptations. So you are going to get the benefits of gaining strength in 5s and 3s, but you are avoiding staleness, right? And then here's some more math. I know, if you're struggling with this math, I'm sorry. I'm sure you could find a course online. I'm just joking. Okay, let's say the sets of 5s give you 15% gains, while 1s give you 20%. So obviously, doing singles is more simulative to max strength. Well, it makes sense. But you still get something from 5s. But you ran singles for so long, block to block to block, that you're only getting 10% gains from the singles. And so even though it's technically more stimulative, when you account for adaptive resistance, that just becomes void. And so using that little bit of variation, you get more adaptations. And so that's another reason why we phase our training, is to avoid adaptive resistance. And so here's a perfect example. If you did sets of 3s and 1s and 8s in the same block, let's say for the competition left, you're just burning variations. So it doesn't matter if you did more singles and then more 8s, you just burn variation across the board. And so it's like, where are you going to go, right? Probably somewhere less optimal. So if you have to then use variations which are less effective for you or make you prone to injury, or instead of going 3s, 1s, 8s, you have to go all the way to 12s or 15s, it's like, as you're going to come to learn, that's not very good for strength, especially not for peaking. And so you have to go somewhere less optimal until you resensitize those ranges again for stimulus. And so fortunately enough, if you're intelligent, you can provide variations and you have enough tools in the toolbox to, obviously, if you run into a situation like this, you can fix it efficiently. But it still begs the question, it's like, where are you going to go? And likely, because some of the best tools often get used all at once, you're going to be left with the suboptimal ones, even if it's by a small chance. And so when you actually, I'm sure you guys are familiar with West Side. If you're not, it's basically like this. I was gonna say Texas, but I have no idea. It was just like this hard powerlifting gym, which is specialized in what's called equipped powerlifting, and they would basically just run heaps of drugs and train super hard and just pull up insane numbers. And so one of the things that they did a lot, for different reasons, is they use high variations, even leading into comp. So they would have like box squat max, box squat with chains max, speed work chains max, just like all these kind of weird variations. And the reason for that is because when you're wearing a squat suit or a deadlift suit, the amount of added fatigue from such a high load, it means you can't, week to week, do singles with the equipment. But you can kind of trick the CNS by doing a little bit of variation. And so you get by with that. And so that's one of the strategies. That's the reason why they did that. But for raw powerlifters, it's got like no application. It's like, why am I doing chain singles like a week out from competition? It doesn't make sense from a different perspective, which we're going to discuss. And that perspective is specificity. That's a whole nother podcast. But the point is, it's like using all these variations, it only works in a short period of time. All right, let's move on. So let's just summarize why we phase our training. So phasing your training to maximize both of those vectors of powerlifting success is ideal. So you need to phase your training to be the best at hypertrophy and at the best at the neurological adaptations. And then once they come together, that's where you see the most effect. And so how much does this increase your results? So what if you try to do both at the same time, ignore all my advice, maybe like 5% better results? Maybe like 10? It's, who knows? But I'm willing to say more than not over a period of time. Because this is when these kind of factors really express themselves, is over time. Because we can talk about these concepts, but fundamentally, if you're training hard, you're progressively overloading in some form, and you're eating enough protein and calories, you will make most of your progress. But what we're discussing here is the fine details. And sometimes the fine details can sabotage most of the progress. Because once you get to this intermediate stage, which you probably are, if you're listening to a podcast like this, you need to actually think about your training, not just look at a barbell and grow. So, and specifically on comp day, that was a little bit of a rant, by the way, but I think it was valuable. On comp day, if you've led to poor periodization, you're going to dramatically suffer in your performance. Imagine doing high volume bodybuilding work like a week out. So you're doing like sets of 15 on hack squats. Actually, let's do a better example. Sets of 20 drop sets on leg extensions. It's like, oh my god, how are you expecting to do anything in competition? It drives me insane. Because it's like you've got no groove with the competition lifts. So you don't even know like how good low bar feels or how singles feel. And you've got no form of strength expression because you haven't been driving those adaptations. So that's a bit of a summary. And so now we understand why we're going to phase our training. Let's look at how we actually get as strong as possible in the long term. And so let's paint a picture. Let's get our paintbrushes out. If you don't have your paintbrush and your canvas in front of you right now, then pause the podcast, go buy it, because if you don't actually paint this out with me right now, then you will never be successful in life. Oh, good, you're back. Thank you for getting your pen and paper. Did I say pen and paper before? I don't know. So, let's say you're a newbie lifter and you've been training for 1.5 years, right? And you just do random shit in the training all the time. Like, you like no thoughts, anything. You just go, oh, this would feel good. And then you do it and you go, oh, it would feel good. And you just love to max out, okay? But you actually want to compete in like 6 months. Like, let's say 6 to 8 months. Like, you're actually keen on competing and becoming a powerlifter and being a somebody. Well, firstly, you need to grow up. Like, stop maxing out. Think about your training. And it's like, get your head out of Instagram. Because I'll tell you what, if you train like Larry Wheels, you're not going to be very successful. That's the first thing. Grow up. And now it's time to actually, now that you've grown up, thank you. That was a very quick process. Wow, you're taller than me. We kind of put our training into 3 distinct phases. And this is when we come back to periodization of like where do what blocks and how we kind of focus on them to get the best on performance. So we have these 3 phases are the volume phase or the building phase. We have the strength phase, and then we have the peak and taper phase. And so each one of these phases prepares you for the next phase. And obviously, like, this is a general rundown and is probably what's the best situation for the described lifter. But different situations require different things for different people. So, for example, without getting too detailed right now, if you've got a competition again in, let's say, 8 weeks, you don't have time for a hypertrophy block. And so you need to kind of think about, okay, do I do another peak? Or do I do like a very specific strength block and then do I do a peak? It's like, those are the kind of questions you need to answer. And they come with some trade-offs. So it's just about understanding these concepts and being intelligent. So what is the volume/building phase? I'm going to list some names off. You've probably heard of these. If you haven't, then welcome. You got like the bodybuilding phase, the hypertrophy phase, the general preparation phase, and you got the phase that's like, fuck it, I'm just going to skip my last set of 10. So that's kind of like the names of the phases. The last one was more of a joke. But I tend to sometimes, I hope you're not listening, coach, I sometimes skip my last set of 10. I tell myself I'm not feeling good. Okay, so what does this phase actually consist of? Well, we're looking at high training volumes, high variation, higher rep ranges. And this rep range is kind of the 5 to 10 rep range for powerlifters. Sometimes you got 4s and sometimes you got 12s. And so if you would actually mathematically describe a load, it would be above 60% of your 1 rep max, no lower. And what actually is the purpose of this phase? So I've just described it. It's like, wow, that's amazing, but like, what am I actually trying to do? So we're trying to build work capacity and muscle mass. Obviously, to all else equal, more muscle is better. But just remember, it's important to consider this, is that if you have more muscle, that does mean a big total, but now you have a smaller dick to leg ratio. So your already small penis is now much smaller. So keep that in mind as we move on to the next slide. Just really clearly, for anybody that's watching the video experience of this podcast, you'll notice the camera kind of changes. And you go, what? Why did the camera freeze? And why is he sitting differently? And where's his shirt? No, I'm joking. I have my shirt on right now. But sometimes my camera can only video for like 30 minutes. And so I actually need to get up and turn off the camera and then turn it back on so I can continue the video. Look, I'll tell you what. This isn't no Joe Rogan experience. I'm sorry. But we sure as hell have better nutrition and fitness advice. Shots fired, Joe Rogan. Sorry, but some of your guests are really retarded. Okay, so what is actually the utility of this phase? So this is kind of breaking down more of the details, the nitty-gritty. Well, variation is useful in this time to do the following. Often to work around injuries. Like when you're peaking and you've got to do competition max squats, you have to do that. And so the good thing about this time is we can use variations which avoid injuries and we can still progress, because that's the purpose of this phase, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit in a second. And obviously to build the musculature around the weak points. So this is a time of building muscle, building work capacity, working around injuries, with the freedom of not being so specific. And there's reasons for that, and we're going to talk about it. For example, building triceps for your lockout. You know, like this is the time where you're going to build the most tricep size. Yeah. It is the perfect phase to tailor, like tailor-made, like a muscle gain or a fat loss diet. Because the volumes are so much higher, high volumes are protective to building muscle. Protective from losing muscle. God, I'm going insane. And high volumes are also conducive to more muscle building. And so this is literally the perfect time as a powerlifter to be gaining and losing weight. So if it's like, damn, it's time to go up a weight class, it's like, perfect, this is my hypertrophy blocks. And there are genuine trade-offs when doing it during your strength and peaking phases, just to keep that in mind. And so, depending on your time constraints, in my opinion, you should be running at least 3 of these blocks consecutively. Because it's like, one block, it's like, you're just not, there's no adaptations. Muscle is so slow. 2 blocks is like totally fine, depending on like your time constraints. And 3, like you really start to take it in the third gear. So like, because like if you think about if you're trying to accelerate to 60 kilometers an hour or fucking miles per hour, it doesn't matter. And you're in first gear. So imagine like, I don't know how many people drive manual, but you don't go very far in first gear. And so what you do, your first block of hypertrophy, it's like you kind of just kind of get you basically start rolling. Like you kind of get everything right. And then second block, you put in the second gear and you get a little bit quicker. And then third gear, you're actually able to accelerate up to 60 miles an hour without just burning out and doing some crazy stuff. And so that analogy hopefully comes clear that the more of these blocks you can do in consecutive to a point, the more hypertrophy you're going to get, because this is a slow process. And hypertrophy, interestingly enough, isn't just you grow muscle. You've also got like, imagine you're trying to build a house, right? And you build the scaffold, and then you build the bricks. And like you can put a little couple bricks down, you can put like the concrete slab, but fundamentally you need to build the shell first, and that takes time. And if you think you're just gonna like build a house and just like build the frame in like 2 weeks and then you should have a house, it's like, no, you need to go through those stages. And so the length of time of 3 blocks, which is roughly like 12 weeks, is a real good time to actually lay down the foundation and build the house and see some tangible results. Because if you just, to kind of elaborate on this analogy more, if you went straight from building the frame of the house and then tried to like have a party in the house, in other words, like go from hypertrophy to strength, it's like, it's not going to be a very fun party, and you might as well could have just had like an open floor, you know? It would be pretty redundant, in other words. So that's my advice. But doing more than like 2 is not fun. Like, let's face it, we're powerlifters, we want to lift heavy shit. And so like 2 is like, in my opinion, like fine. So that's my thoughts. But if you're doing 1, fuck man, better have a good reason. So strength phase. What is it? Congratulations. It's a boy. No. Congratulations, you made it through, right? Like, you got through that bullshit volume stuff. Now let's get heavier and actually use that muscle. So now it's time to take those adaptations the CNS have been making for the hypertrophy stuff, and now let's actually make it do some heavy stuff. Lifting heavy stuff, and like what we want, you know? God, I am struggling with the comparisons and analogies. Generally, this rep range is confined to 3 to 6. But the accessory work is within the 6 to 10. And you're sometimes doing like 12s. So 12s are things on like bicep curls or lateral raises. God, have you done like a max set of 10 on lateral raises? It just hurts. It's not fun. So like, even with those kind of things, you can totally do 15. But like, for reasons such as fast twitch fiber hypertrophy, like an emphasis, you're probably ideal to stay like below 12, 10. So that's kind of like why the accessories are in that phase, or in that rep range. And so for your main strength movements, it's like your main squats and your main deadlifts and your main bench and whatever else you're trying to get strong at, really. The rep range has got to, like the percentage threshold is above 75% you want at max. Well, 75% and above. So that's just like a requirement for actually facilitating strength, because any lower than that, we can't really guarantee solid, like reliable strength returns. If you're like a beginner, you can just look at the bar and like boom, you go, oh my god, my biceps have grown finally. It's like, but when you're an intermediate, you just can't look at a bar and do that. And so yeah, let's reiterate what the purpose of this phase is, because it may not have been clear, is to turn that new muscle mass into something useful. Because like, unlike yourself, it's like you're getting measurably stronger, but like you're still not getting laid, you know? So it's like, it's time to make something about you useful, and that will be your muscle. And so, important thing to clarify about this phase as well is that we are moving closer to specificity over time. So, kind of like our hypertrophy phase where things are more general, like let's say you're doing safety bar squats, you can still do safety bar squats on your strength phase, but as we approach the most specific strength phase before our peak, that will make more sense in a little bit. That's when we're gonna kind of maybe do more high bar or more low bar. So again, let's kind of discuss some intricacies of this phase because that's important. This is what this podcast is about. So, what is variation for Jesus Christ? What is variation useful in this phase? Well, injury workaround a little bit, and positional training. So, what is positional training? So, let's say when you squat, your hips rise up before you, and you just kind of like good morning it. A lot of that can just be due to a lack of musculature, but it could also be like a technique thing. It can also be a cueing thing, and maybe you don't have the neural strength, so your body is firing the wrong kind of muscle. So what you can do is you can find a variation which resists that movement. So for example, you might find doing high bar squats results in you, because in order to do a high bar squat successfully, or even a safety bar, there you go, fuck, I love the safety bar, you're forced to stay more upright, and it resists that movement. It's the opposite of what your low bar squat is letting you do. And so now what you're doing is you're training the opposite movement, so by the time you get to the low bar, you have fixed that error, hopefully, or to more of an extent. So that's what positional training is, and that's really useful during a strength phase because now it's time to grain in some of those neurological adaptations. And you can still sort of grow muscle during this phase, but because the volumes are less, it's not high volume, it's moderate volume, you won't grow as much. And so it's mainly maintenance, but you can grow a little bit of muscle. And so because of that, your surplus or your bulk size should be reduced. So if you're during your high volume, let's say you gain a 400 calorie surplus and a 400 calorie deficit, I'm just making this stuff up, it could be higher or lower, you might want to consider doing a 250 or a 300 calorie deficit or surplus because the steepness of your deficit cannot be continued while maintaining the same level of muscle because the volumes are lower. And remember, high volumes are protective of muscle, and high volumes build more muscle. So if you just kept the same surplus size, it's likely you're risking more muscle loss and you're increasing fat gain because that's just how it is. And there's also a discussion about what's called stimulus to fatigue ratio. So let's talk about the squats. What is this concept of stimulus to fatigue ratio? So imagine every set of squats you do, say set of 10, you get one stimulus, just mathematically the number one stimulus, but you get 1.5 fatigue. Okay? This is for low bar squats. And let's say you do, and you try, this is the stimulus for quads, and fatigue is everywhere. And now let's say we do safety bar squats. You get one quad stimulus, but 1.3 fatigue. So your level of fatigue for the same amount of stimulus is lower. So the ratio of stimulus that you gain versus fatigue is better. And that is good for building muscle. And even for strength, to a smaller extent, it's more nuanced for strength. Because we also have to consider that, God, who cares about how fatiguing deadlifts are? We need to do deadlifts. And raw stimulus magnitude is probably more important when it comes to accessories during a strength phase. But when it comes to building muscle, we can only have so much fatigue. Let's say our weekly fatigue bubble is 20. So every time you do a set, you minus the fatigue, you take the fatigue out, and then you spit out the amount of stimulus. So that's what happens. And if you have better stimulus to fatigue ratio exercises, things that provide you less fatigue, and you can measure that, fuck, how did that feel? And stimulus you can also measure, God, are my quads pumped? Am I disrupted? Am I can I get out of bed tomorrow? And so you kind of if you prioritize stimulus to fatigue ratio favoring exercises, you can get more stimulus because the fatigue is just linear. You can obviously increase your fatigue window by surplus, good sleep and good recovery, all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of like during a strength phase, we often have less stimulus to fatigue ratio favoring exercises because now we're reintroducing low bar squats. We're reintroducing, let's say, conventional deadlifts or sumo. Like, our competition lifts are about moving the most weight, not building the most muscle. And, interestingly enough, if you increase the absolute load of something, you also increase the amount of fatigue. That was a really long rant about stimulus to fatigue ratio, but hopefully that was clear. If it's not, please let me know and I'll answer your questions. So, how long are we actually going to be running this block for? In my opinion, at least like 2 consecutive blocks of dedicated strength phases is ideal in my opinion. Because again, it's like that first to second gear kind of analogy. But like factors like competition timelines can influence like the length of these phases and how many of these phases you do. Because if you have like a competition, like if you just done a competition and you've got another one in 5 weeks, it's like, fuck, what are you going to do? It's like, you might take an easy week of like singles and then you might run back into a peak, or you might do like a very specific strength phase because you got another one after that, which is more important. It gets really complicated with that kind of stuff. But it's about weighing up your best options. Okay. Alright. Let's get into peaking phases. So what is a peaking phase? This is where we dial everything up to 12. Number 12. Okay? And what is this phase consistent of? Very low volumes. Very high intensities. Very low variation. This phase is about your competition lifts as heavy as possible for the highest quality singles and doubles and triples we can get. And lo and behold, I just said it, the rep range for this peaking phase is 1 to 3. Okay? And obviously there's nuance with this variation. The accessories are mainly like 4 to 6. Sometimes you can get 8. With the accessories, we're going to touch on that in a little bit, and that'll make more sense in a second. But there's no lighter than 85% of your 1 rep max. Okay? Like that is the threshold for max strength in competition, is 85%. And, well, that's the purpose of what this phase is about, is building as much 1 rep max strength as possible for the competition lifts on competition day. Okay? Now, let's break into the nuances and the utility of this phase. Like, get really into the details. Well, the variation is extremely minimal. You, honestly, like, you have to have a really good reason to be using variation on the main lifts during this phase. Like, if you don't have a good reason, then why are you doing it? In fact, I can't even think of a good reason in my head. There probably is, and I'll be enlightened, but you have to have a good reason, and it's justifiable. But if you're like, yeah, I'm just gonna like, I don't know, like Zercher squats, like 3 rep max, I'm like, the fuck you doing? Seriously. Like, you're just impeding your recovery. It's like, and then you got max bench the next day and your elbows are fucked. It's like, what are you gonna do? And so, and also, you're not adapting for the 1 repetition max squat on competition day. What are you gonna do, a Zercher squat on comp? You're like, yeah, just set my rack height to like 2 and I'll just like Zercher it. And then you get like called on depth because the bar, imagine that. I wonder if you could actually do a Zercher squat in comp. Surely not. That's a side tangent. And so, the accessory work we do in peaking phase is really just about maintaining the musculature. And that's like really it. Obviously, you want to do like some injury prevention. You might want to do some external rotations and really lengthen up the workout. Like your warm-up window, sorry. But the accessories are really kind of bland. And on that topic, you want to be choosing accessories which provide you really good stimulus fatigue ratio, but keep in mind are also very competition similar. So it's probably better to be doing high bar squats as a squat accessory than leg extensions. Then again, because of the adaptations, and you're not pushing these accessories hard for overload thresholds, you're pushing them for maintenance thresholds to maintain that musculature, but you still don't want to run the risk. So that's my personal advice. Eating at maintenance is a really, really, really good idea because your training is so low volume, you're just going to get fat if you gain weight, and you're just going to lose heaps of muscle on a cut, especially because you can't drive up the volume. You just can't, because high volumes elicit a fatigue effect, and that prevents you from expressing strength. You could be super strong, but you can't express it. And so, and another thing as well is that you change your leverages. If I decided I was gaining like 2 kilos over a 4-week peak, God, my stomach might be bigger. And that affects my deadlift leverages. And now, each session, I'm basically just using variation. I'm causing variation on my body because I'm changing my leverages. And like, obviously, like, fuck, if you gain like 1 kilo, it's not the end of the world. Like, seriously. Like, you can be a fat piece of shit, but you're just gaining fat. If you're like Larry Wheels and you decide you want to gain like 20 fucking kilos within like a peaking phase, god damn it. No wonder why you have grip issues. It's like because you completely change your leverages, and each session you're adapting for something completely different. So it's like, how do you know what you're doing is competition specific? It's like, well, you sort of are, but it's going to be different on competition because you're still going to gain like 5 kilos, and now your leverages have changed. And that is a small detail, but it is still something to consider. It's just safe to eat at maintenance during this phase. Just eat at maintenance. Problem solved. Okay? And look, 1 block of peaking, that's like all you need. Okay? The injury risk is so much higher. The moment you introduce such high loads, your injury risk is like, phew, like through the roof. Like hypertrophy phase, let's say injury risk is 1. And let's say strength phase like 1.2. Fuck, during a peak can be like 1.7, like 2. Like that is where the injury risk is found. It's not like people think powerlifting is so dangerous. Yeah, it's like you get like a little bit injured during like your peak. And then the rest of the phase is about preventing you from getting injured and also like fixing injuries. So it's like, is it really that dangerous? But the danger is found during that peaking phase. Okay? Alright. I'm going to do some thinking for you guys. You probably have some questions, and I want to answer them before you think about them, because it's important to kind of figure out what I'm about to talk about for understanding this kind of stuff. So, the question would be, why not run a peak after a hypertrophy block? It's a good question. Why not just go straight from hypertrophy straight to peaking and just avoid the strength phase? Well, moving from relatively light loads to much heavier loads causes a considerable injury risk. Like, your joints and connective tissues are not adapted to handle those kind of loads. Like, at all. And so you go from, like, doing, like, 60% of your 1 rep max to, like 85, and it's a movement you're not accustomed to. It's like, man, it's like, snap city. And peaking is exceptionally low volume as well. And this is another concept as well. The best neurological adaptations for strength occur during strength blocks, not peaking. So, because the volume is lower, you are getting less experience and less touches with the bar and less overload potential at the sacrifice of higher loads. And so what this means is, if you did 3 sets during a peak, it's not going to be as stimulative as 5 sets during a strength block. You might get 10% more stimulus. Okay? Because strength blocks are about actually building the strength, and peaking is about expressing that strength. And so you don't get as much gains. Like, peaking is just expression. The gains are made during the hypertrophy and the strength blocks. There's no way around it. I'm sorry, you just grow more muscle and you build more strength adaptations that way. So that's why we have a strength phase. And it's also like it also acts as a transitionary period for injury, and you get better results. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, we're getting to the end of the podcast. That's kind of what the different phases are, how I would phase them to be the best over time. But what would you do after competition? Dude, if you're competing in like another 4 or 5 weeks, don't take a week off. But if you're just like, yeah, let's celebrate, have some good food, take a week off. Like, just relax, let your body rest, because even though the volumes are lower, you're still like, you could be like a little beat up, and you just want to give yourself like a week of just take training off, relax, ease back into things after, and just let your body rest, because it needs to heal, and you just give yourself that psychological break as well, because peaking honestly is like the worst mentally. Okay, then you might want to move into what's called a transitionary volume block. Obviously, unless you're competing soon. So, oh my god, Ashton, there's like another phase, a transitionary volume block. Well, not really. It's just a volume block, but be really easy on volume. Because you're going to be super sensitive, and like you might get your best growth week 1 on like 2 sets of squats, like in one session. And so just ease your volume, ease back into training. Like the loads are obviously going to be super light because you're not adapted to like doing sets of 10. But like after like week 3, you'll just be in the groove. You'll be set. So that's my personal advice when it comes to after competition. And that's all I have for this podcast today. Thank you so much for listening. I had a lot of fun writing this script up. I know I probably got a little bit too complicated in some scenarios and overlooked anything. But if I did, please let me know, and I'll answer all your questions. If you want to go give us a follow over at BigFitStrong on Instagram, where you'll find the links to the podcast. And then please come over to Spotify and rate us a 5-star. That would be amazing. That would help me a lot. And if you want to find my personal Instagram, head over to @deadlift.squat.bench. And that's kind of like where I put my own training. I kind of share a lot of the Big Fit Strong stuff. And so it's almost like a central hub if you just want like a one-stop follow. So anyways, thank you guys so much. I'm out now.